Right. So now this diagram, okay, there are obviously there's a lot happening in this diagram, and we will go through each one of them one by one. This diagram actually shows the architecture of the entire Beckn ecosystem. As you can see, there are multiple layers stacked on top of each other with very clearly defined roles and functions. We'll be going into each of these layers in detail and in subsequent slides as we go along. So every entity that wants to be part of this network will find a place in one or more of these layers you see in front of you, right? So the bottom layer are the specification and the support layer, okay? That provides all the resources and support required to implement the network and test the network, okay? The top two and the top two layers, we have the actual runtime of the network in the form of consumer provided interfaces, server-side applications, and routing infrastructure, okay? The middle layer is an underlying infrastructure, right? As I said, in the internet, there needs to be an underlying infrastructure like the ISP, which allows you to plug into the internet. Similarly, therefore, to perform commerce on any open commerce networks, you require an underlying infrastructure which actually allows the transition of platforms which have implemented the specification into actual live transacting entities on the open network, right? So there is a rite of passage. As I said, it's not just enough for us to implement a TCP/IP protocol stack and just plug into the internet. There is a sort of a rite of passage which you need to go through in order to actually become transacting entities, right? So that infrastructure basically consists of open registries which list various platforms and their endpoints to be discoverable by other platforms, right? Just a quick trivia to everyone. Does this seem familiar? Does the infrastructure layer seem familiar to you? Is this something which you might have heard of before? Because it's almost like a sort of a derivation of the same concept which we are currently using. Any ideas what this might look like? So you can see local registries, you can see country level registries, and you can see root registries. Is there does anybody want to take a guess as to what this might look like? What is this? What is this analogous to?
Blockchain.
Sorry.
Blockchain.
Can you try again? Something which is more fundamental, which came much before blockchain.
OSI model.
DNS.
OSI model. Yes, somebody said DNS, right? DNS, more than DNS, is actually, it represents the chain of trust, right? When it comes to SSL certificates, right? So there is a root certificate authority. There is a what do you say, country level certificate authority. There are local certificate authorities. So basically, it sort of also represents not just the DNS, which was right actually, and it also represents the chain of trust, right? Both packed into a single infrastructure. Right. We will talk a little more about this infrastructure layer. It's a very interesting layer, right? But basically, fundamentally, what it basically represents is the rite of passage for anyone who has implemented specification to actually get listed on one of these registries, so that they can actually transact, okay, on the open commerce network. Okay. Each of these layers have their own independent evolution in terms of complexity and scale. Together, all of these layers work in tandem to create an ecosystem which we call as Beckn. Now, we talked a little bit about the 4 layers which you see. On the right, you will see a lot of supporting infrastructure, right? You can which allow platforms to quickly become Beckn enabled, right? When I say Beckn enabled, it means that you have implemented Beckn protocol and are ready to transact on the Beckn network. So there are a lot of supporting components which allow you to quickly become Beckn enabled and make sure that you are following a standardized language. You're sort of speaking the same language across the network, right? There are certification companies, okay, which basically test your platform against various use cases, against the standard APIs and the standard schema which are being used in the Beckn protocol, and actually issue digital certificates, right, of compliance, which when used will sort of, it acts like a certificate that, hey, I'm ready to transact on the Beckn network. There are audit agencies which sort of look at a top level transaction history and see if there, and it's sort of, there are audit agencies which sort of set these top level compliance standards, like for example, like if somebody is searching for something, you should receive, you should send back only the kind of search results which are relevant to them, and not some random search results, right? And so there are audit agencies which help audit the data of the platforms which are plugged into the network, and actually make sure that all the platforms are adhering to a certain compliance standards. We'll talk a little more about that later. There are system integrators which basically how to put it. So, yeah, so say for example, if I'm a small company which has a bike, I own a fleet of modified electric bikes, right? Now I want to quickly plug into this open network. Okay, now one way is that I hire a tech team and then make them study the specifications and actually actually pay them a salary and make them build an entire business out of it. Or what I can do is I can actually contact a lot of people who have already implemented this specification, are offering some packaged products which help me quickly plug into these networks, right? So there are system integrators which can help you accelerate your enablement, Beckn enablement, right? There are consulting firms which help manage entire networks, which basically contact the buyer end and the seller end, and sort of generate that demand inside the network, and basically help them come together and make them understand why Beckn as a protocol is actually going to be a win-win for all of them, right? And there are legal firms which basically manage the licensing of the specifications, etc., which in fact is under the CC BY-ND, which is Creative Commons non-derivative, no attribution attribution license, basically. That the legal firms basically manage that aspect of the entire specifications. Okay. Now now that we have a fair understanding of the specification, let's just look at a slight comparison. Okay, as I said, we will be drawing a lot of analogy. This is sort of a summary of how Beckn is very similar to the internet. Right? There's a very common misconception amongst many that when they hear the word specification, right, it's not a single specification, right? What they don't realize is that that the creation of an open network requires implementing multiple layers of infrastructure, each having its own set of specifications. Okay, so this table shows the comparison between HTTP and Beckn protocol across various factors like methods, like scaffolding, infrastructure, etc. Like for example, methods. Okay, now HTTP has got a very has a bunch of very generic methods like get, put, post, patch, and everything. Beckn has a similar set of methods like search, select, init, confirm. As I said, Beckn is a commerce-aware protocol, okay? Which means that Beckn has in its own methods, okay, has a slight commerce component to it, right? Search means what? You're searching, you're discovering for something. Select is like you're selecting items which you have, which you searched for, right? And then there is init, and there is confirm, and then there's cancellation, order, status, etc., tracking. So we'll go into these slightly in slightly more detail as we go along. Okay. So and then there is the packet structure, right? HTTP has got it has got headers and it's got a body. Beckn has something called as context and a message. And then there are schemas. Now, HTTP doesn't have a specific schema per se. I mean, of course, it has, but it's more at a message packet level, but not exactly at a content level. It doesn't really care about what content goes into in the HTTP packet, right? But Beckn does have an underlying schema where it basically defines all the various components inside a typical commerce transaction. And then there are other standards, right? There is an addressing infrastructure, right, in HTTP, which is basically your domain name system. Beckn has open registries. There is a routing infra, which is basically your DNS gateways and your IP routers. And similarly, in Beckn we have Beckn gateways, right, which help route any packets from one node to the other node, depending on what the context is. Right, and then obviously there is basically other infrastructure, like there are open standards, right, which we talk about. Like HTTP has its own set of open standards. Beckn also uses a set of open standards. So that's pretty much summarizes like the comparison between HTTP and Beckn. Right? So yeah, for example, trust infrastructure, right? Trust is a very important thing in commerce. Right? But trust infrastructure, you have SSL certificates at HTTP, in HTTP, right? It sort of allows you to show your, sort of prove your trustworthiness at various levels. For example, you have class 1, class 2, class 3 digital certificates. You have domain validation, extended validation certificates, right? Which require stricter and stricter compliance as when you apply for such what do you say, trust certification. Similarly, Beckn also has a trust infrastructure, which are basically digital certificates which are obtained by certification agencies.